Okay, so we'll continue with question 14. So we're on to question 14. So the council says it's the design charter is a non-statutory document. The council has endorsed its use, and as I understand it's prepared by the West Midlands Combined Authorities, including Shropshire Council, and the council said that policies align with the principles of the charter. Does the council want to add anything before we move to people? No? Okay. One of the issues I think was about whether it should refer to the National Design Guide or whether it needs amending in light of that. Do you want to make any comment before we...
I think we'd have to check to see, obviously, consistency with that, and obviously also check to see if there's already a reference inbuilt within the West Midlands Design Charter as well. But I think we'll be open to the possibility through that. Yeah.
Let's see what other people have to say. So who wants to make comment on policy SP5? Nobody? Okay. Oh, sorry. You're obviously hiding. You've got Mr. Young as your assistant today.
As well.
She makes things
Everybody said.
Thank you. Yes, it's Ron Harding from the Home Builders Federation. It was just a really minor point that we picked up in terms of our hearing statements. In the paragraph 2 of the policy states that the development should be in accordance with the design principles in the West Midlands Design Charter, and we just had concerns about that need to be in accordance with, as obviously that document hasn't been through this examination and isn't being tested in this process. Perhaps we thought it would be better to just sort of make reference to it in light of that rather than having to be in accordance with it.
Does the council want to come back on that point?
Yes, I think I would say the West Midlands Design Charter is fairly strategic in nature. It's not an extensive proposal. It's something which obviously Shropshire Council has adopted as a material consideration and is in as evidence to the local plan as well. I haven't got the reference in front of me, but it is part of the evidence. Our preference would be to continue with the wording as is. If you have a concern about that, and a tweak to that would be useful. EV 124 is the reference point. If you did have concerns about that and wanted us to consider a modification, a tweak to the wording in the way it is referenced, we would be happy to consider that.
Thank you, Mr. West. We'll have a think about that. Can I just check that the design charter, was it subject to any public consultation? Or? Sorry, I'll put you on the spot there.
I will have to check if it was. I suspect it. I don't know for sure, but I suspect it was at the West Midlands level. I don't believe when we adopted it as a material consideration in Shropshire it was, because it had already been subject to engagement elsewhere. It's already a document, so it's not something we could have changed in that respect. It wasn't ours to change, so we will have to check whether it was subject to consult kind of elsewhere in the process at the West Midlands level. We can check that out if that's helpful to you, Inspector Crosby.
That's not a critical matter. It might even say in the beginning. Sometimes these documents say at the beginning, don't they, when you look at them, whether it's been subject to consultation. The other point was, and I've now just forgotten. Yes, so when it was endorsed for your own use in development management purposes, that presumably was an endorsement through a planning committee that.
It was cabinet.
Cabinet resolution.
A cabinet resolution. I don't have it in front of me, but it would have been along the lines of agree that this would be used as a material consideration in planning decisions as appropriate. Yeah. And for plan making, I'm told, which is wrong.
I want to say it's been through a democratic process in terms of elected members, yeah.
Yes, it has. I suspect at the West Midlands as well.
Okay, if there's no other comments, if we move on to policy SP6, which is the one about health and well-being. SP6, so again, whether the health impacts of the local plan have been assessed and addressed, and whether SP6 is justified, effective and consistent with national policy. So the PPG says that plan-making bodies will need to discuss their emerging strategy for development at an early stage with NHS England, local clinical commissioning groups, health and wellbeing boards, sustainability and transformation partnerships, etc., and the implications of development on health and care infrastructure. I know there's been some debate about what's in the past with that, as though that's improving that relationship between the NHS and the council in terms of moving forward. So I think there's been some criticism of what's happened in the past, but I think it's seen as that's a bit water under the bridge, hopefully now. Do you want to say any more about that before we...
I don't think we need to add to what was said yesterday, but obviously, obviously Mr. Carter wasn't here yesterday when that was referenced. Obviously, under that matter, I indicated that obviously we'd engage in a positive way with the CCG locally as the gateway into the health group in that respect, and I think that's been acknowledged within the response from Mr. Carter. But absolutely, we have a strategic infrastructure network, which is, as I said yesterday, has received officer approval to proceed, and obviously the NHS group and the trust will be part of that in the future. So yeah, I don't have concerns about the relationship that we've had, but I think it will inevitably improve through this network.
Okay, there's a couple of things that have come out through the statements. One of them is whether the policy should refer to specialist housing. Another is in relation to the need for additional capacity at medical centres, hospitals, for example, and whether that's being considered. And the other point, which is about, is it reasonable to expect all major development proposals to comply with policy SP610, so provide a health impact assessment? I don't really want to briefly run through those, and that might help people around the room. Do you want me to go through? So the first one was about specialist housing. The second was about additional capacity at medical centres and hospitals, and the final one was about SP610, so the HIA requirement.
So if I could start, Mrs. Crosby, with regard to the specialist accommodation, as we discussed earlier, I think it's important to remember the plan should be read as a whole, and we consider we have an appropriate strategy for delivery of specialist accommodation. I think that probably is sufficient on that point.
Thanks, Dan. Just in picking up the second point about the health infrastructure, as I said yesterday, we have engaged constructively with the CCG, particularly around medical facilities and particularly around existing capacity and future capacity as a result of planned new development. So we have engaged constructively with the CCG on that point. Now, and there are proposals within some of our site allocations, which I know we're not speaking about today, but we will get onto hopefully in terms of the potential for land within some of those allocations to facilitate additional medical facilities. We also have obviously a developer contributions policy which specifically references the need to prioritise critical and it's critical infrastructure, that those items of infrastructure which we think are crucial to development, and where there is sufficient evidence in play, we would consider that the health infrastructure would fall under the critical kind of infrastructure realm in that respect, but obviously on the balance of evidence at that point in time.
Okay, thank you. And then the final point was about whether it's reasonable to expect major developments, or major developments. I think what Watson was saying was that major development is can range from, I think it's 10, isn't it, up to, I suppose, thousands.
I think the important aspect of SP6 to 10 is the fact that its expectation is it's to be accompanied by proportionate health impact. So it's very much recognised, as we said, that major development is diverse, and we would expect that health impact assessment requirements alongside to reflect that sort of diversity, so it should be proportionate in scale.
Thank you. Just looking around the room, is there anybody who particularly wants to comment on anything else that we've not already dealt with? Mr. Mr. Hassad.
Thank you. Just a small point in relation to the HIAs. Our point was in relation to the PPG, which suggests that HIAs are a useful tool where there are expected to be significant impacts. And whilst we understand the proportionate element, we think that the policy should only relate to where there are expected to be significant impacts rather than all.
Council want to come back? It'll be quite difficult to do with the poll. I suppose you wouldn't know when you put your application in whether there was a significant impact, would you?
Well, yeah, I think this is, it's probably in the realm of where pre-application conversations would come in, I think, on this one. Obviously, we support pre-application, and I think it's at that point where we can have a discussion about the proportionality of the evidence to support that application, and it may well be that as part of those discussions, certain parts of the requirements are not there. But I think pre-application is where we need to be on that one.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Burns.
Thank you, Ma'am. Just picking up on that point, we've made suggestions as to how that part of the policy could be amended, and it just needs to make reference to a screening assessment. Yes, that could be done through pre-app discussions, but then there is a formal process to determine whether a HIA is actually required, and that's through the preparation of a screening assessment. So it's quite easy for the policy to be updated to make reference to that.
Mr. Burns, is that something that's the screening process, is that something that's referenced in national policy somewhere, or just so I'm clear what it is you're talking about?
It's referenced in the matter statement, paragraph 2.7, which makes reference to the health impact assessments in Spatial Planning Guide, which is prepared by Public Health England.
Mr. West.
Yeah, thank you, Inspector Crosby. I think we also need to remember this is a strategic approach in the policy as well, so probably not one for finer grain in terms of exactly how a planning application would work, but there possibly could be a main modification proposed to suggest something along the lines of be accompanied by inadequate and proportionate health impact assessments. I don't know if that eases the concern at all. We'd have to look at the screening issue a bit more, I think, on that one.
Yeah, it sounds like it's not a planning policy document as such, it's something in a different realm, isn't it? The difficulty of building something like that into a policy is if that document gets updated or changed it becomes quite difficult, doesn't it?
Yes, and what we're not trying to do is be challenging here, over challenging. I think what we are trying to do is set out quite clearly the potential for a proportionate health impact assessment. I think it's right to include it within policy to allow a decision maker through a pre-application process to have that consideration. If you didn't have it in, it wouldn't be achieved. So it at least allows the opportunity for the decision maker, for the council, to require it where it needs to.
I wonder if it's something for the explanatory text, so that you could put something in there to try and just flesh it out a little bit more, so it gives clearer sort of steer as to what.
We could make reference to a pre-application maybe in the explanatory text, and in terms of the proportionality issue as well. We'll be happy to maybe go away and think about some reading around that. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. If it's an explanatory text, if some things change over time, it's less of an issue than if it's embedded in an actual policy, isn't it? It's, yeah. Better.
Thank you. Yes, it was a helpful discussion, contribution from the council earlier about the fact that following the submission of the representations we have met with the council and hopefully the sort of implementation procedures will be overcoming the difficulties that we've had. And I think that as we've set out in our representations, actually I think those difficulties arise as much from the complexity of the NHS organisationally as it does in terms of the liaison that may or may not have been taking place with various parts. I'd just like to make a couple of general points, if I may, and that is, while my clients don't question the overall approach to the quantum and distribution of development and the commitment of the Council to sustainable development as part of the plan, we nevertheless think it's important for it to be recognised that the planning system should also play its part in contributing to the provision and improvement of supporting services of all types to meet the needs of a growing population, including the level, quantity and availability of health infrastructure. We believe that health infrastructure should be regarded as a critical component of sustainable development, and it should be seen as sitting alongside in importance as things like the provision of schools, new schools, expanding schools, and improvements to the transport network. Accordingly, we'd like the plan to help enable the support for the provision of health infrastructure arising from the growth where that otherwise can't be funded. The plan submitted stresses the importance of providing new or improved primary care facilities, particularly as part of major development proposals, but we feel there's a need for the plan to support the provision of health infrastructure across the board to meet the needs of the growing population, wherever that might be within the area. As far as we can tell, and this is perhaps something of the next week almost, but from the evidence base, we don't think that the potential health infrastructure requirements have been taken account of as part of the viability study. But, again, hopefully we would hope that the arrangements and our participation in the strategic infrastructure and investment plan arrangements would help to address that and move forward, and my clients are committed to fully participating in that process. One other point I think is that we think that that Shropshire was a very early adopter of SIL, but that means that the SIL now is currently quite out of date, and I think probably because it was adopted early, it's actually very light on the provision of health infrastructure. So we would be really quite keen if the outcome of this examination could be to sort of ensure some refresh at an early date of that, although I know that might be a bit complicated by sort of possible legislation. In terms of the policy, as we have said in our evidence, we support policy SP6, and in particular the provision, I think it's at point 5A, but the numbers may have changed, I don't know, but it's point 5 is create sustainable communities through retention, and then point A specifically deals with delivery of health facilities. But I do wonder if that could possibly be slightly strengthened by saying, or adding in, it currently says supporting the maintenance and delivery of health facilities. Could that actually be improved by saying supporting the maintenance, improvement and delivery of health facilities? And that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you. It's useful to hear from the Council on the matter of the SIL, and particularly the main modification that's being sought by the NHS.
Yeah, thank you, Inspector Crosby, and thank you, Mr. Carter, for that. In terms of the SIL point, we were the second authority in the country to adopt the SIL. And so we've been running it for a number of years. We have our rates with our schedules at the moment have increased with indexation at the moment, so if we can provide information on what those are. Clearly, at some point there will be a need for a review of the charging schedule, but equally we are equally aware that we are in a moving situation with the infrastructure funding, with the SIL as well. And after today, we might be even more of an evolving situation on that one. Who knows? So I think where we are, I think the main point here, though, is the SIL is a fit-for-purpose mechanism to get developer contributions to support critical and priority infrastructure. The charging schedule itself does not state what infrastructure it will be used on. This is a decision for the council based on evidence, and that partly based on evidence in our investment plan, which we've put into the examination, which specifically references community health facilities and NHS community healthcare facilities. So there is this, the mechanism is working. I agree it can always be improved, and I think through the strategic infrastructure network with the contributions from the wider NHS group, that evidence base will only improve with time. You had a second point.
The main modification that Mr. Carter was seeking.
Which was so supporting the maintenance, delivery and improvement.
It was maintenance, improvement and delivery, I think it was the word improvement that was seeking to be.
As I sit here today, I don't necessarily have an issue with that. It is a strategic approach. I think it isn't. I think it's something which we could certainly support in terms of MA modification.
I'll go to Ms. Stover and then I'll turn to Ms. Ellis. Thank you. Quick question with a yes or no answer. Is a health impact statement required for developments of over 120 dwellings or more? If you talk about the health impact assessment, that would be definitely classed as a major development. So I think from my memory of years ago working in development management, it's 10 or more, wasn't it? Yeah. So the answer is yes. It would require a proportionate is the word, so yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Miss Alice.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Crosby. I'd to say that we would very much like to review any further wording that the Council puts forward and to reserve our position either to make written comments on that or to deal with it at a later session. The whole topic of contributions for health is quite an evolving one. My clients, or one of my clients, Taylor Wimpey, were recently involved in as an interested party in a judicial review in which I appeared, called Hand and Field Action Group against Buckinghamshire Council, which looks at this issue to some extent. And there's quite a lot of practice and learning and indeed various legal opinions by very eminent people doing writing on this whole area. And if something is to go into the plan, it perhaps needs to have regard to that, or at least be phrased in such a way as to take account of the fact that this is it's quite a particular area, as I said, with quite a lot of its own learning. The only other thing I would add is that, of course, with any development which is EIA development, environmental impact assessed development, then the implications for the health of populations is a topic under the regulations, which may or may not get scoped in or out in a particular case, but clearly that's provided for major developments by the law. I hope that's helpful, Madam. Thank you.
Thank you, yes. And hopefully helpful for the council to consider, Mr Richards. As you'll be aware, Ms Ellis, any main modifications would be subject to consultation at the relevant stage or further discussion should they need to be. Any other comments? I can't remember what question we're on now. Was it 15? No? Okay, so we move on to question 16, which is about policy SP7. So this is managing housing development and whether it's positively prepared, justified, effective and consistent with national policy. And I think the question here is whether it's reiterating all the policies and national policies, whether it's necessary. What does the policy do that others don't? Is it effectively a windfall policy? Those sorts of questions, things that seem to be raised. I don't know if the council want to say anything before we open up to the floor to see if anybody wants to comment.
All I would say is I think it is a necessary thing to have in the plan. I think it is yes, it deals with perhaps elements covered by other policies as well, but sets out quite clearly a circumstance where additional market housing may be required, and in that instance, I think it's it provides the leeway within the policy required by the framework, the flex, which is required by the framework. So I think it's necessary, and I think is quite clear in its intentions.
Thank you, Mr West. Mr Durbin, did you want to speak, or is your name plate up from before? Okay. So policy SP7, does anybody particularly want to comment on that? Mr Roberts, and then Mr Pearce, and then Mr Burns.
This is the policy that I was referring to when we were talking about Longdon.
and in particular about the development boundary and how it's been drawn very tightly around existing development. But it's accompanied by an allocation for 50 houses. Now, Longdon has only got 136 houses as it stands, so it's a big increase in the number of units in the village, and therefore a big increase in population, obviously. And the residents of Longdon, their experience has been from the previous plan, when they had no development boundary and they were only classified as one element of a community cluster, that nevertheless they got a series of planning applications for anything between 15 and 50 houses on the outskirts of the built-up area. Now, happily, all those were rejected eventually, but this part of this policy at SP7.4 specifically allows the possibility of development outside development boundaries where there's the likelihood that a settlement allocation is not going to be made, is not going to be delivered. And that, of course, leaves the people in Longdon looking back over the past three years or so, thinking, where would we have been if we'd had a development boundary in those years? We would have had great difficulty in the appeal situation. I did note, Ma'am, that you said earlier that the allocations of these villages isn't a target. And I do appreciate that. But that's not the way developers see it. They see it as a target to go for, rather than a target that you hope won't be reached. So I think something needs to be done with that element of this policy, because the rest of the policy is really saying, and it mentions of SP10, well, SP10 says you don't have development outside the development boundaries. So there's a conflict there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. The council wants to comment on that tension between policy SP10 and SP7.
Yes, I don't think it is I think it is it's an approach which is designed to deliver a bit of leeway in the plan, and as you will see from the policy and the way it's written, we do clearly say that the guidelines around settlements, which are guidelines, not anything else, are a significant issue in decision making. So I would hope that gives some reassurance for Mr. Roberts. He's shaking his head, so maybe not. I live in hope. But in terms of, we just need to look at, I just need to refer to policy SP10 just to make sure that it's bear with me seconds, Inspector Crosby, sorry.
So I look at that. So presumably it would restrict what could go outside the settlement limits to 4A2 G, I think, which is quite a limited scope.
There's no reference in the countryside approach to SP number 7, managing housing development.
But it is referenced in the whole policy.
But it is referenced in the hub policy, so it is referenced in policy SP8, which is obviously would capture London in that example. Now, it does attempt to set out, and the reason why this policy is here is it does set out the issues that we would take into account if there was an issue with the delivery in a settlement, if an allocation, for instance, wasn't happening for whatever reason, and compelling evidence was provided of that. Those are the considerations we would take into when approached for an approach for market housing development outside the development limits. So I don't think it's inconsistent. I think its intention is to deliver some leeway in our approach to delivery of housing development, but it does clearly indicate that the guideline for hubs is a significant issue in decision making.
Just as a kind of example, the way I've not read it all in detail, but the way I read it, that outside the development limits of somewhere like Longdon, you would only allow things that fell within criteria A to G, which are fairly common things that occur outside settlement limits. So, for example, Barrett's, for argument's sake, came along and wanted to build 30 houses outside the settlement limits. And there was just mainstream market housing, that wouldn't be permissible, is that?
That's correct, yes. A to G, yes, in the managing development in the countryside, yes. A to G, those are the considerations of we would consider, and those are the types of residential development we would consider, or the types of development which would restrict market housing development. Obviously, the exception potentially to that is in the cross-subsidy policy on affordable housing, and that is the intention of that is there is a potentially element of market housing within an otherwise affordable housing proposal, which may well be outside the development limits of a village, but that's in a separate policy.
Okay.
So that's one exception, which I think is probably referenced within SP10 itself.
So these 4A to G would be permissible regardless of whether the target had been met within the community anyway, wouldn't it? Because they're above and beyond that target, presumably. So even if that target had been met of 50 or whatever it is, these other things would still be permissible within this policy. So rural exception schemes, gypsy and traveller sites, all those sorts of.
Assuming it's subject to the policy managing housing development, SP number 7, 3, A to D. So A to D under point 3 of SP number 7 are the considerations which we would take into account if there was a proposal within a community hub, even if it's adjacent to the hub but outside the development limits. Those are the considerations we would take into account, one of them being the implications on the guideline for that particular hub. So if it was greatly exceeding the hub guideline, those are the considerations we would factor in, including things like the benefits of the proposal, the likely delivery of the commitments already in the community hub, the cumulative impacts of the development, and the level of increase on the numbers in relation with the guideline. So that's the kind of approach we would take.
So it seems that those words that Mr. Roberts has referred to is almost giving false hope to a developer that they would be allowed, because that sort of implies that if it's not being met within the settlement limits, then they would have a sort of free rein, if you like, on just market housing outside the settlement limits, which I don't think is what you're saying is the case.
No, it's actually not the case. No, it is restricted. It is. It's in the circumstances when the guideline is not being achieved, then there is a potential for market housing in its own right outside the development limits. That's what SP number 7 indicates under
But it says it'd be strictly controlled in line with policy SP10, which provides much greater limitations. That doesn't provide for main sort of just bad houses, standard housing site. Am I right?
Yes, it would not take that into account, but what it's trying to do is say, yes, it would be strictly controlled in line with the policy, and would only be considered acceptable where there's clear evidence that the guideline for the hub is not being achieved or is unlikely that it will be met over the plan. So it sets the consideration for the exception effectively on that point. So it's saying it will be in line with our approach to managing development in the countryside, except in the instance where there is compelling evidence where the guideline is not being met within the plan.
I think we probably need to go away and think about the wording, and I'm not sure it's entirely clear as it stands at the moment, but we'll make a note of that and we'll cover that in our letter.
I'll just come back with a very quick one. The problem there is that the allocation is almost set up to comply with that exception, because 50 cannot be accommodated in the village, and that will come into play.
Yeah, we've understood your point, so we'll go away and give that some serious consideration. Mr. Pearce, is it a different point you wish to make?
Thank you, John Pearce from Harrislam. The point I'd like to make is the policy appears to be set up to permitting or supporting windfalls. So the first part of the policy says, positive consideration of other sustainable housing development within which is in accordance with other policies of the local plan. And the second part of the policy then sort of builds on that, sort of indicating that unallocated sites would be supported. You then get to the third part of the policy that then seeks to sort of say, well, we'll support it so far as long as it doesn't exceed the development guidelines for the individual settlements, which appears to be putting a cap on the level of development that individual settlements can deliver. This would indicate that it's contrary to government policy of seeking to boost the supply of housing, and we do sort of query the criteria that the council then set out that will then be used to determine whether proposals that will exceed the development guideline would be acceptable or not. I think that effectively that's already covered in part one of the policy that says proposals will only be supported where proposals comply with policies of the local plan. It then seems you then have to have a separate set of sort of considerations in order to determine whether a proposal would be acceptable or not. I think in essence, part three of the policy is effectively covered by parts 1 and 2 in determining whether windfall developments would be acceptable or not. And I think our view is that part 3 of the policy isn't necessary and should be deleted. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask the council to.
Importance of the policy process and the role of development settlements. There's development guidelines in the following discussions with the infrastructure providers, for instance, and they recognise spatial strategy for the distribution of development. So the intention part is to recognise the role of that guideline. However, it is public policy where exceeding the level guideline is appropriate, and with the specific considerations if that's the case. So it's not something to guidelines, but it's something to ensure the role of the development guidelines is recognized discussing the infrastructure providers. So we it's not make sure if the guidelines are being exceeded, we just consider the benefits of the proposal aside from the plan, the deliverability of the commitments within the settlements, particularly and the guidelines settlements. We think a positive approach the plan implement strategy for the distribution of development.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. Mr. Burns, and then I'll come to you, Mr. Deves.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Burns. I'm Pegasus Group on behalf of the Wimpy Strategic Land. You have comments already about the appropriateness of Part 3 of the policy. Just building on that though, I think one thing that doesn't flow through to this policy is this urban focus that's throughout the rest of the plan. That can be highlighted by the fact that similar restrictions are also set out and referenced in Part 1F of Policy SBA, which deals with community hubs, i.e. the rural areas in the plan. That also seeks to restrict development unless it accords with the various criteria. I think we've got concerns with it, but I think the urban focus does really need to flow through to this, particularly as Mr. Corden was referring to infrastructure requirements. Then if we've got the urban focus, then any one, I don't want to call it oversupply, but for the purpose of this I will call it oversupply against those settlement guidelines, is being provided in the correct approach. So my suggestion would be that this is amended so that this only bites on settlements that are either strategic settlements or the principal centres, in order to keep that urban focus through to policy SB7. I think we disagree with that. They do recognise the urban focus, and that it's relative to the guidelines. It's obviously the large settlements, the urban settlements, significantly higher guidelines, and proportionally that would be affected in terms of considerations. But we still need to ensure that through in the world, it's rather than conversations of infrastructure recognised. As I say, we consider it's a broad aspect of the policy, and it what it does is it seeks to balance those considerations and ensure that considered in circumstances as being exceeded. It's not seeking to cap that, it's just providing the considerations in circumstances to be exceeded.
Did you?
Yes, just one comment. It was just really in relation to the importance of the guidelines here. It is a continuation really of the approach which is in the currently adopted plan around the significance of the guideline in determination. It's the balance act we have to make between supporting a flexible plan, but ensuring enough clarity for both the decision maker, but perhaps more importantly for the local community a little bit as well. Obviously, we have a lot of communities here who will be affected by their developments in the future, and we feel as though this appropriately manages the development against a guideline but has sufficient leeway to deal with situations where that guideline is not being met. That is the intention of the policy, really, and yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Deeves.
Thank you, Mr. Crosby. Mr. West and Mr. Corbyn and Mr. West in his last sentence has crystallised my concern. I'm less concerned with oversupply than undersupply. Guidance not being met says to me that guidance is a target. We've heard several times this morning from the Council and elsewhere that guidance is not a target, and it seems to me there is a fundamental inconsistency here. Thank you.
We don't see that inconsistency.
Okay, Mr. Stewart.
Thank you. We've heard a lot about the importance of the residential development guidelines, and I've been looking through the background papers trying to understand how they've been worked out for each settlement, community hub, etc. Apologies if this is related to the next couple of policies, but it was just really how you've come up with those numbers, whether it's based on need, capacity of infrastructure, etc. Just want to try and get a grip on how those numbers have been arrived, since they're so important to the many community hubs. And
so say that was discussed. Was you here this morning?
Very briefly, yes.
We discussed this morning about how the community hubs and clusters, the sort of how they were put into particular areas, and then in terms of the numbers, maybe the council can help on that.
Yeah, I believe we did discuss that. In a nutshell, we looked at the settlement within the spatial strategy and the associated settlements of settlements. And we looked at the specific characteristics, constraints, and opportunities that existed within each settlement and formed our proposed development guidelines. They were then subject to consultation, and we carefully considered the responses to those consultations, and that's informed the proposals for specific settlements in terms of their development guidelines.
So in terms of the numbers, how was that led? So how did you set it out? 50 for London and 20 for somewhere, whatever, you know?
So we then settlements, characteristics, its constraints, opportunities, also things like the existing commitments and completions that existed, and formed our approach in terms of the guidelines settlements. In terms of hubs, we're very much aware they are in terms of their nature. I think that's very much reflected in terms of the strategies proposed for those specific settlements. So, for instance, we've got large hubs with proportionally higher development guidelines, whereas a settlement like London, where we recognise it is a small hub, it's got a guideline reflective of that settlement in terms of its role in hierarchy and level of services and facilities and infrastructure available to support development.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Mr. Stewart?
It does partly. It's just that that's not set out anywhere, so it's the first time I've heard that as a justification for it.
Is that set out in?
I believe we consider the various consultations. So we prefer distribution development the first guidelines for the large settlements, the strategic principal key centres, and then we prefer to talk about the levels of development in community hubs. So I believe those sort of factors were drawn up through that process. That's informed the specific guidelines for those settlements.
Thank you.
It's probably more an explicit point that I'm making then about the numbers for each individual site rather than the strategy behind how the numbers are distributed, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you, Mark. Just wanted to say something about policy SP7 4. I wasn't intending to say anything, but in light of the debate that you've just had about it and your indication that you're going to cover it in your letter, I thought I'd just make our position clear. We support policy SP7 4. The way we read it is that what it's saying is that in a situation where the development guidelines for a settlement are not met, then additional market housing will be or may be permitted, and that additional
market housing beyond the category set out in SP10, which, as you rightly said, would be permitted in any event. If anything, we would invite you to give consideration as to how the policy could be made more effective. So at the moment, it talks about a situation where that this will only happen where the settlement appears unlikely, the settlement guidelines appear unlikely to be met over the planned period, and we think that's too vague. In order to make the policy effective, permission should be granted for additional market housing at a point in time within the trajectory when you can actually do something to ensure that sufficient housing does come forward. Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you. Yes, it wouldn't rely on waiting until sort of 2 years, for example, before the end of the plan period to think about.
That's right. No, I just envisage a situation where there's 1 year of the plan left,
yes,
and the local planning authority says, "Well, Mr. Chung, we've still got a year left. Don't worry, it's going to happen."
Okay. I think those what I've written without thinking, there are some implications, isn't it? So I don't really want to come back on.
I think just obviously national policy already has mechanisms in place in circumstances where there's supply issues or delivery issues. They're well known by everyone in the room, so fortunately I won't try and look at quotes. But I think on the other matter, we'll wait for your letter.
Okay, thank you. We've got a note of your comments, Mr. Chung, so we'll take all that into account.
In response to that, what I would say is that the well-known national mechanisms, we're not quite sure what's going to happen to them. So the council's made a decision here in its plan that it does have certain limits for all of its settlements or guidelines for its settlements, and it'd like to see those delivered. And if they're not delivered, it would countenance development outside development boundaries. And we would say that you should stick to that regardless of what decisions government makes as far as national policy is concerned.
Thank you. Do the council want to come back on any of that before we move on? Question 17 relates to community hubs and community clusters and the approach set out in policies SP8 and SP9. Clearly we don't want to go over the ground I went over this morning with community hubs and community clusters. This is very much about the policy wording. So there are quite a lot of concerns around this from various people. Just before we move on to this, I'm conscious it's 4:15 now. I'm not sure how long this is going to take. I know there's quite a lot of people interested in this particular question, I suspect. And some people indicated they wanted to go at 5 o'clock today. Mr. Deeves, Mr. Young, is there anybody else? Ms. Pellegrim. Are there particular areas that you're interested in that we could deal with more quickly? Or?
Thank you for your consideration, Mrs. Crosby. I'm interested in question 18 and 19, so in a related way, if I could be permitted to take them both together, that may save us some time.
Okay, I'll just see what other questions people are interested in, whether we can sort of manage the process so that 18 and 19, so they might take a while to deal with anyway, those questions. Mr. Young, is it a particular question or is it everything that you're interested in?
Can I just check about the progress on, SP12? You're planning to get to that this afternoon, is that right?
So that's question 19. That's the one Mr. Deeves is interested in as well. I'd hope to get there this afternoon before 5 o'clock, but it depends on the question takes on community hub and cluster, because that might take a while.
Can I just make could you indulge me for 60 seconds? I'll just make one point, and then I won't be too troubled about the time, if that's okay.
I'll just see what else other people are. Was it Mrs. Pellegrim?
Sorry, I just wanted to speak to question 17. That's why I had my hand up. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So it's question 18 and 19. Are you both happy to make your points now, but happy that you won't necessarily hear the debate that goes on? Obviously, it's been recorded, so you'll be able to listen to it on catch-up when you wanted to. Are you happy with that? And then it means that if this goes on a little while, you can just get up and go if you need to go. Is that Okay, so I'll hear from Mr Young on question, was it 19?
Yeah, it's a related topic to do with the employment. Mr Hopkins is here for this session in terms of those issues, but really it's just in response to this relationship between housing and employment. And Mr Burns very helpfully indicated that if you stripped out sites that were not necessarily going to be new employment sites, that would be 39.2 hectares. He told us using his calculator, and I think we can all admire a man who's good at using his calculator. But can I just complete the exercise for him, if I may, which is that even if you work off that number, which is 46 homes per hectare, then the figure for Bridgnorth, which is 1,800 homes, doesn't come anywhere close to the Shropshire average of 103 homes per hectare. And even using that different figures that he introduced, you're still looking on an equivalent basis for 4,000 homes in Bridgnorth. So I'm not going to argue 1,000 homes with Mr Byrne, because it's a lot of houses above the 1,800 that are proposed. So just to complete that exercise, and that just fits into the economic growth strategy alongside the housing. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Mr Young. I'll give the council an opportunity when we get to that question to address that if you wish to. Mr Deeves, you wanted to address question 18 and 19.
18 and 19, Mrs Crosby, okay. Thank you. Dealing first with question 18, that is SP10. We note that the National Framework at Power 81 sets out significant weight should be given local businesses to support economic growth, allowing each area to build on its strengths and so on, which of course is entirely sensible. The question set is, should it be flexible and less restrictive? We say yes, but our difficulty lies with the wording of SP10, particularly paragraph 3 and its subclauses. This sets out a list of employment types. We consider that this whole approach is bad, or unsound, it should be more correctly, because in the future new types of employment will occur, new types of employment opportunity, particularly around the circular economy, renewable energy, and all sorts of effectively unimaginable forms of employment over the term of this plan. We therefore suggest that this section, this policy, in fact, be rewritten in terms of the attributes rather than listing the specific types of employment, and that it therefore will be a lot more future-proof in the way it is interpreted by successive inspectors and planning officials. As it stands, it is a hostage to fortune to a very, very rapidly changing future. So that is our submission in respect of SP10. SP11, SP12 sets out in its term that it is keen to promote renewable energy, independence and local economy at paragraph 5b, which we agree with, of course. The test, though, is it effective, as posed by the agenda? We believe not, because although this policy sets out in itself a wholly desirable outcome, it is severely weakened by the strength of SP3 and the other policies that are around it. So it comes back to this major point about the sheer weakness of the approach. SP12 itself is a good thing, but it is encased in a very weak structure, so it is not likely to succeed. And that is really all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your readjustment of timetable.
Thank you, Mr Deeves. So if you wish to go, do you want to go now or do you want to, it's up to you.
I can bear another 15 minutes, I think. Okay. I'm sorry. Thank you. Oh.
Okay. So we're back to question 17, but it just means you're free to go whenever you wish to go. The community hub, community cluster issue. Does the council want to say anything before I take people's comments?
I think we've probably just in the first instance reference our matter statements and the responses.
Thank you. So in terms of people that want to speak on question 17, I'll do the same thing, so go around and anybody? Mr. Roberts, I think is the first one, yeah. So Mr. Roberts.
Thank you. Basically, it's the same comment on this policy as we made on the last one. You'll see that SP8(2) says development proposals outside development boundary of community hubs will be managed in accordance with policy SP10, and then other relevant policies in the local plan. So the basis is that policy SP10, with basically saying that only special types of development will be in the rural area, appears to set the scene, and yet we've got this conflict with policy SP7, which again allows development not in line with policy SP10. So it's the same point, but a different policy.
So taken in isolation, this policy is probably more in a sort of common policy that restricts development outside development limits in line with those. So that's probably less contentious in a way. In isolation, that's less contentious.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay, just so I understand that. Okay. Sorry, Councillor Dennis.
Thanks so much. I'm not going to reiterate the points that I made this morning, but I think for the hub and cluster approach to be sound, it's got to be based on evidence. And our concern is that the evidence base is just not robust enough. As I very, very briefly mentioned earlier, when it's reliant upon the open space needs assessment, which purports to be from 2017, but actually only less than 30% of sites were visited, and it's reliant on data from 2009 using completely different methodology. I don't see how that can be considered robust and up to date when it's over 13 years old and used a different methodology. And I think this is then illustrated in, although the council is saying that the methodology is being used objectively, actually there is far too much subjective interpretation going into it. So the only example I will use is the Renshaw's Field situation, where we were surprised to see that at one point it's considered an outdoor sports facility, then it's considered an amenity green space. And so when something can be classed differentially at different parts for what we can't really understand, I think it calls into question the robustness of the evidence base of the hierarchy of settlements. And at that point, the whole hub and cluster approach seems arbitrary. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to come back on that point, or are you happy you covered it this morning?
I think we covered it. I think we covered it this morning, Ma'am. Yeah.
That's fine. Thank you. Mr. Is it Andrews? Yeah.
Yes, again, just briefly sort of recapping on points that the gentleman made, that the general policy of the hubs and clusters we probably don't have an issue with, but it's based on the hierarchy of settlements, and if that isn't correct, then the structure of the selection of hubs and clusters is flawed, and therefore that makes that part of the plan unsound, and that needs adjusting and correcting before a list is set in stone for the next at least 5 years. But also picking up on the gentleman's point of view about the wording in SP2, SP8(2), about the final words "and any other relevant policies of the local plan," that opens up the scope in it from SP7 to allow open market outside, whereas we had understood that all that would be allowed outside would be
rural exceptions in whatever form they are allowed under the cross exceptions or other policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew. Ms. Pellegrin.
Thank you. I'd like to start by making an apology. Apparently we were expected here this morning and we misunderstood, so we're only here today, this afternoon. However, the question is whether the community hub approach is justified, effective, and consistent with national policy, and whether these policies duplicate parts of other policies. So my points that I'm going to make right now actually do relate to what you discussed this morning, but also I think to the effectiveness of policy SP8. And I'd like to reiterate what Councillor Dennis said. I, as I said already, represent Ford Parish, who have severe concerns that the settlement hierarchy was not methodologically sound. It appeared that the criteria and targets changed through the assessment process, and the criteria don't actually define daily needs. So if we go back to that settlement hierarchy document, we see that primary services, which are the facilities that people should expect on a daily basis, are different from the secondary services, and yet a settlement could have entirely only secondary services and still qualify for a community hub, but be lacking all of those things that people need in their day-to-day needs. So this is a fundamental flaw in the reasoning behind the selection of a community hub. And I apologize if you've already covered this this morning. I checked, and the approach used here is absent in both the NPPF and PPG, so it appears to be made up by the officers. And though my clients, the parish council, repeatedly tried to get their score amended, and this is explained in our representation, so I won't repeat it here, they feel that their score is 32, despite all of the evidence that they've given, some of which is quite compelling, that some of the open spaces now got housing on it, or permission for housing, for instance. The score remains 51, so the discrepancy is 32 points versus 51 points. So we would argue that the score upon which this criteria, or the allocation as a community hub, is neither reliable nor accurate. So then we want to return to the urban focus, which is the promise of the local plan. And in the case of Ford, it's not met. The SAMDEV identifies Ford as open countryside, yet the local plan review is now allocating 125 houses, 75 is an allocation. The criteria in the settlement hierarchy indicate that there is not sufficient local services to meet daily needs of people. The NPPF says, in paragraph 78, that policies should be responsive to local circumstances and support local housing needs. Now, in the case of Ford, we have officer testimony that there is no requirement for additional housing, and indeed a recent built affordable housing scheme is not fully let or sold, as I understand. So there's not a local need, or not a demonstrable local need, and it certainly isn't responsive to local circumstances because, of course, the parish council says that they haven't got the services required. So again, this promise of the urban focus has not been met. That leads then to an unsustainable development that, in the case of Ford, since it does not have the services, and the new housing scheme as proposed in the policy does not actually provide the day-to-day services required. It does go extensively into transportation infrastructure. But it just means that what is already a settlement where people have to drive to Shrewsbury will have even more people who will have to drive to Shrewsbury. So it's not promoting sustainable development. So going back to policy SP8, the wording of the policy is community hubs are considered significant rural settlement centers, which we dispute, as such appropriate development will be permitted on allocated sites where it complies with all of the following considerations. So if we go to point D, I'll read it to you. There is sufficient infrastructure capacity to support the development, or any infrastructure capacity constraints can be addressed through the development consistent with relevant policies in this plan. Well, as was demonstrated in the score for the hierarchy of settlements, there are not sufficient services, and yet it would not be possible for these 75 new homes to provide those services according to the requirements of paragraph 57 under developer contribution. So it would not be reasonable for 75 houses to make provision for a doctor's surgery, for instance, which is one of the things is identified in the primary services that are required for a settlement. So what we're saying is that the entire basis for the selection of these community hubs is a bit illogical, I'll put it that way. So returning then to National Planning Policy Guidance, paragraph 8, the overall approach, this is about sustainable development. For Ford Parish is not sustainable development, we would argue, because their own assessment identified social, economic, and environmental deficiencies. There are no jobs in Ford, and yet there is no way to actually address that through paragraph 57 of the NPPF. Paragraph 35 of the NPPF says the whole approach to the settlement hierarchy is not justified. Officers used their judgment, changed their minds throughout the process, did not listen to counter evidence, and have identified a place that does not meet the day-to-day needs of the community. So the thresholds are poorly defined, subjective, and changed without justification. And finally, paragraph 78 of the NPPF, this is referring to housing in rural areas and the policies. Ford is a rural area, according to the SAMDEV, and the local plan does nothing to elevate it beyond that other than provide more housing. So the NPPF requirements for rural areas, the planning policies should be responsive to local circumstances and support local housing needs, has not been met in Ford. So as you will see from our evidence submitted to you, the Parish Council wishes to not be designated as a community hub and have no development boundary as a result of that. However, should a development boundary be required and you go against their wishes in your final decisions, and they do wish to have a tight development boundary to make sure that Ford doesn't expand further, they're very concerned that their proximity to Shrewsbury will prove attractive to developers. So they would like to have a very tight development boundary, but they wish to have no development boundary at all. Thank you. I'm sorry that was a very long response, but it was a culmination of an entire day's evidence from us. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you. Does the council want to comment on any of that? Obviously, most of that was things that were covered this morning.
There's quite a lot to unpack there, but from the village perspective, I'll just confirm, I'll just clarify. I'll just clarify that obviously we have classified that village as a hub. We don't agree with the objection around the level of scoring. We feel as though our scoring is resilient in that context, and which is captured in the hierarchy of settlements. The evidence base in the hierarchy of settlements, and I would just agree. Well, I would just again indicate that is an objective proposal, and the subsequent consideration of the settlement plan for those individual villages, wherever those hubs are, that is where I suppose the professional judgment has come in on that respect. So the appellant is correct that the objector, is correct in that there is no methodology at the national level for us to do this. We have, this is a localised methodology, and I think some of the concern today is around the methodology on this one. There seems to be concern about the methodology, but also concern about the application of the methodology. So I think there's two distinct issues there. We would say our methodology is a resilient methodology, which has been through obviously, which was developed early on in the process and has been subject to local community views. Inevitably there will be some concern about the application of that, and we've sought to deal with that through the process. So I don't really want to say anything more about that, because I think that most of that was dealt with in this morning's session.
Yeah, I think it's probably useful. Something else that came out this morning, from my understanding, is in the SAMDEV plan, where this site was clearly open countryside. That process for allocating those sites in one or the other was very different. It was an opt-in, opt-out, whereas this is a more objective. Now there's not an opportunity to come back. They've had your chance to speak. Then this has been done in what's potentially a more objective way. I think that was what came out of this morning.
Yeah, that's correct. The current process, which is in the current development plan, was based on an opt-in process only. It worked. We felt as though it worked. But however, we feel as though on this occasion a more objective process to defining the hierarchy was needed, and this is why we've applied this approach, which does specifically look at the services in an area to seek to I suppose allocate the most sustainable development options in terms of in terms of our rural villages. So I think we've identified 39, 40 community hubs within a Shropshire context of how many settlements have we got down? 550. Over 500 settlements in Shropshire. So it's a relatively small amount of villages. We've actually proposed 4 hubs in this instance. In terms of the community clusters, that continues to be the opt-in process. So if a parish council wanted to opt in to become a community cluster, we continue to require a parish council to opt in, and on each occasion we've honoured that.
Thank you. You're both from Ford Parish Council, is that? Yes, okay. Was it something a different point you wanted to make, or?
I was just going to highlight that in the statement in the statement that we submitted for the hearings, we did highlight criteria by criteria in the hierarchy where we disagreed with the points, and why, if you needed to refer to that as a detailed point.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Landau, did you want to speak?
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon. My name is Edward Landau. I'm representing Landau Planning Consultant. Sorry, I am from Landau Planning and representing Mr. and Mrs. Holland. My point is quite specific in relation to policy SB 9.2. I wanted just to start by saying that one of the purposes of the development plan is to provide clarity and certainty for landowners, developers and third parties. And I want to provide a sort of a balanced submission to this examination. As written, the policy is quite specific. It's quite easy for anyone to interpret, so there is clarity. The criteria regarding development within clusters refers to conversion of existing buildings, and I'll come back to that. Infill sites of not greater than 0.1 hectares within settlements, substantial buildings on 2 sides, and a maximum capacity of 3 dwellings. I would say that's overly restrictive and prescriptive, if I may say so. I think it will exclude many appropriate sites, such as sites on corner locations, perhaps some tandem developments, previously developed land which is perhaps greater than 0.1 hectares. I do think it's important to have criteria and to have the policy's criteria referenced. I agree that there should be reference to conversion of existing buildings. I agree there should be reference to within settlements. but I think there should be some flexibility regarding the number of units, 3 to 6 dwellings. I don't see any need to prescribe the size of the site. I think it's too prescriptive, 0.1 hectares. I think there is some conflict with the policy as written with SP 2.6 and paragraph 3.23 of the local plan, and in relation to MPPF 78 and paragraph 78 and 79 relating to providing opportunities for growth within villages. Those are the points I wish to make, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Landor. Do the council want to come back on?
Yeah, thank you. I just make the point that they're considered appropriate within community clusters and they're recognised within paragraph 2. We feel that the various forms of development are appropriate in the context of community clusters. In nature, it's important to provide certainty for all parties, including the decision maker, and we feel with specific regard to infill developments, we feel that for all parties. In terms of we referenced a figure of 3 to 6 dwellings. Well, I think that possibility is over there. 3 dwellings. We're not saying every site will be 3 dwellings. It could be 1, 2, or 3 as appropriate. And that would depend on the nature of the settlement, because obviously there are policies that would inform what is considered an appropriate scheme on such a site. But the important thing is to recognise that's what is considered appropriate in community clusters. There are particularly affordable schemes that are considered appropriate within community clusters. So it recognises very much the role of types of settlements within the hierarchy, and I think it's responsive to that, responsive to the diverse nature of communities. I feel the framework are appropriate and provide certainty that you feel is important, and I totally agree with you. I think it is important to provide certainty for all parties, and I think the policy does that.
If I may, Inspector Crosby, it was just a point really about just reiterating the point about the clarity to both the decision maker but also the community. Obviously, in respect to managing development in community clusters, these are parish councils that have opted in to a process who have positively indicated to Shropshire Council that they would like some degree of development, but even though they are relatively small settlements and fall under our classification of community hub. So it's a positive move from parish councils in order to do that, and I think this policy allows that degree of clarity in response to what we mean by infill development, with a degree of leeway, as Mr. Corden has set out.
Thank you, Mr. West. Mr. Maxfield.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. I just wanted to say that I want to make reference to SP9, but only when we come to later question on whole estate plan. So it's just to put a marker down. Is that okay?
That's fine. Yes. Yes. Are there anybody else want to speak on this? No? Okay. So we'll move on to policy SP10. I'm conscious it's coming up to sort of 5 o'clock. I wonder if we just have a quick 5-minute comfort break, just to allow everybody to stretch the legs, use the toilet. I don't know if there's any tea or coffee left, unless you can squeeze the things. I don't think to sit like 6 o'clock. If it gets to that sort of time and we've still got things to deal with, then we'll look at ways. I know through the programme officer we've already discussed how that might be done, maybe by a virtual session or something at a later date. But if we have a quick break now, it allows people who want to go and leave the people in the room who want to carry on and listen. Okay. So we'll just break till about 5 to 5.